I was just a teenager when I took on a babysitting job for a single dad, one who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He told me his wife had died during childbirth, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for him. Here was a man doing everything he could to raise his little boy on his own. His son was only 3 years old at the time, a sweet little boy with those large, innocent eyes that always seemed to be searching for something beyond his understanding. It was supposed to be a routine night. I'd been babysitting for a while, and this job felt like just another one. The father had a business meeting, and he warned me he'd likely be back around 10 p.m. Around 8:30, I found myself sitting in the living room with his son, reading him a book. The calm was almost soothing. The only sounds were the soft cadence of my voice and the crackling of the fireplace in the background. But then, without warning, everything shifted. I was mid-sentence when the boy suddenly looked up at me. His tone wasn't the usual whiny voice of a child. It was deliberate, unnervingly calm. I lowered the book, confused, as his eyes locked onto mine. Before I could say a word, he began to sing. It wasn't the playful, cheerful tune you'd expect from a toddler. No, it was slow, deliberate eerie. The itsy-bitsy spider climbed up the water spout and pushed Mama off. His expression never changed. His face was completely still, void of emotion. And then the sun came out and buried Mama's body in the ground. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unsettling weight. I stared at him, unsure how to respond, but he didn't notice my panic. He went right back to playing with his toys, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just sung something that sent a chill straight to my bones. I tried to brush it off. After all, he was only 3, right? Kids say strange things all the time, but something about the way he sang it, the monotone, the twisted lyrics, it didn't seem like something a child would come up with. It felt rehearsed, as if it came from somewhere darker. When the father returned at 10, I couldn't shake the image of his son's eerie song. I had to tell him, expecting him to laugh it off or at least explain it away. I recounted the strange moment. But when the words left my mouth, his expression changed. He went pale, his body stiffening as if the life had drained from him. He stood frozen for a moment, as though turned to stone. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, my words hanging in the air, waiting for him to respond. And then, finally, he broke the silence. His voice was low, strained. "It's time for you to go." There were no questions about how the night had gone, no polite small talk. He simply handed me cash, far more than what we had agreed upon. $200 extra, to be exact. I remember holding the money, my mind racing with confusion, but I didn't dare ask questions. At that moment, I was just a kid, and that extra money felt like a blessing. But deep down, something told me this was far from a normal babysitting gig. I thanked him, grabbed my bag, and left without a second thought. But it wasn't until nearly 10 years later, almost to the day, that I uncovered the chilling truth. By then, I had long moved away from that town, but I still kept in touch with a few old friends. One evening, out of the blue, I received a message from a friend who still lived nearby. It was a news article, its headline sending an immediate wave of nausea through me. Local father arrested for wife's murder, body found buried in backyard. My heart sank, my mind went blank. I clicked the link, barely able to comprehend what I was seeing on the screen. But when the man's picture filled my phone, my stomach churned. It was the dad, the one I had babysat for all those years ago. The article detailed how new evidence had surfaced regarding his wife's death. Authorities had recently discovered her body buried in their backyard, exactly where it had happened all those years ago. As I read, my hands shook and memories flooded back. The boy's haunting song, the father's unsettling reaction. When I had told him about it, it all hit me like a tidal wave. The sun came out and buried Mama's body in the ground. Those eerie words, the twisted nursery rhyme, were more than just something a child had randomly said. Somehow, even at that tender age, the boy had known. He had known. And now, in the aftermath of the arrest, I couldn't stop wondering how much more he might have understood. What other things had he said or done that were clues, hints at the dark secret buried under the soil in that backyard? Did he remember what he had seen? Had he heard something, witnessed something? I'll never know for sure, But what haunts me most is the father's reaction that night. The way his face went ashen, the way he rushed me out of the house, stuffing extra cash into my hands as if it could somehow erase everything. His desperate attempt to cover the truth only made it clearer. For years, he had lived with that secret, hiding it behind the mask of a grieving widower. And now, the truth had come out, but I still think about that little boy sometimes. What kind of person did he grow up to be? Did he ever fully understand what happened to his mother? And deep down, I wonder if he always knew the truth, even as a child. It was a typical evening at home. I was supposed to be watching my little brother while my mom went out to a birthday dinner. Nothing unusual. He was 6, that age when everything feels like an adventure or a game. But he wasn't the type of kid to have imaginary friends or indulge in too much make-believe. Still, it was my job to keep an eye on him, make sure he wasn't getting into trouble. As I walked down the hallway toward his room, I noticed something strange. His door was half open, and I could hear him whispering soft, hushed words too quiet for me to make out. I stepped closer, my curiosity growing, and peered through the crack. There he was, standing in the middle of his room, facing the open closet. His eyes were locked on something inside. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping fully into the room. He didn't flinch, didn't look startled. He just turned his head slightly toward me and said, "I'm talking to my friend." I hesitated. "Your friend?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice casual, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "My friend from the closet." Now, my brother wasn't the type to have an overactive imagination. He wasn't one of those kids who dreamed up imaginary friends. He was more into action figures, video games, things with rules, things that made sense. The idea of him having a friend in the closet felt wrong. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe he'd picked up something at school or seen a strange show on TV. After all, kids will be kids. But as I turned to leave, something made me stop. I felt at first a tap, cold and light, on my shoulder. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like someone was trying to get my attention without being too forceful. I spun around, half expecting to see my brother playing some sort of prank. But when I turned, he was still standing by the closet, staring at me. No, not just at me, into me. His eyes had a strange intensity, as if he was looking past my skin, beyond the room itself. And then he smiled. A slow, deliberate grin. A chill crawled up my spine. "My friend likes you," he said, his voice soft, but unsettlingly certain. I stood frozen, trying to process what he had just said. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something held me in place. I couldn't leave, not without checking the closet. I walked over slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. My heart hammered in my chest, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. I yanked it open, half expecting what? I don't even know. But it was empty. Clothes, toys, an old stuffed bear slumped in the corner. Nothing out of the ordinary. "See?" I said, more to myself than to my brother. "There's nothing here," but he didn't look relieved. He just kept staring, that eerie, unsettling smile still plastered on his face. "Where's your friend now?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked. "He's gone," my brother replied, his voice flat. He said he'll be back later. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Even after we closed the door, something that had been standing in the room with us just moments ago. I checked the entire house after that, going room to room, opening every closet, every cabinet. But of course, I didn't find anything. When my mom got home later that night, I told her about what happened. She laughed it off, saying I was overthinking it. "Kids have wild imaginations," she said. "You're reading too much into it." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But something about that night never sat right with me. It felt too real, too wrong to just be chalked up to a game. I let it go, though. We never spoke about it again. At least, not for a long time. Years passed, and life moved on. The memory of that night faded. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, like a shadow that stretched longer than it should. I hadn't thought about it in years until one day, completely out of the blue, I asked my brother if he remembered his friend from the closet. We were older now, both of us in our teens, and the house had long since lost its eerie charm. I didn't expect him to remember, but he did. "Oh yeah," he said casually, like I'd asked about an old toy. "I remember him." My stomach dropped. "What was that all about anyway?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "You always talked about your friend, like he was real." My brother shrugged. "He was real. At least I think he was." I stared at him, waiting for more, feeling that same creeping unease from years ago. "What do you mean?" He paused, as if weighing how much to tell me. Then, in the same nonchalant voice he had used all those years ago, he said, "He was just a friend. He stayed in the closet for a while. Then one day, he told me he was moving. I guess he left." I felt a chill run through me. "Why did he move?" My brother looked at me, a strange glint in his eyes. "I don't know. He just said it was time to go." We never talked about it again after that. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Sometimes late at night, I'll think back to that night and wonder, who or what was my brother really talking to, and why did it tap me on the shoulder? When we were kids, my little brother and I were inseparable. But there was a period, about a year, where it felt like we were glued together. Not by choice, though. He was terrified to sleep in his own room at night. During the day, everything was fine. He'd hang out in there, play with his toys, do whatever kids do. But once the sun went down, that room became a no-go zone. It got to the point where we pretty much shared my room. My parents didn't think much of it. Just a phase, they said. Kids get scared of the dark all the time, but it wasn't the dark that scared him. It was something else. I'd ask him why he couldn't sleep in his room. He was always reluctant to talk about it. But one night, after another failed attempt to get him to stay in there, I pushed a little harder. That's when he told me. "There's a little boy in my room," he whispered, eyes wide like he was confessing some deep secret. "He talks to me at night." I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or be creeped out. "A boy? What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "He comes out when it's dark," my brother said, gripping the edge of his blanket. "He likes my toys. He always wants to play with me, but I don't want to play with him." At the time, I chalked it up to imagination. He was young, maybe 6 or 7, and kids say weird things. But the way he said it made my skin crawl. The unease grew in my chest. But I dismissed it, convincing myself that it was just a phase. For almost a year, he wouldn't sleep in his room. Every night, he would come to mine, claiming that the little boy wouldn't leave him alone. Sometimes he'd wake me up, whispering that the boy was standing by the closet or sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at him, waiting for him to play. It freaked me out, but I figured it was just nightmares, nothing more. Eventually, the fear faded. By the time we hit middle school, he was back in his room, and the little boy was never mentioned again. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But years later, when we were in high school, our parents dropped a bombshell during one of those late-night family conversations, where everyone reminisces about the past. Out of nowhere, my mom casually mentioned something about our old house, the one where my brother had refused to sleep in his room. "Did we ever tell you guys that a little boy used to live there?" she said almost offhandedly, like it was no big deal. My brother and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Mom sighed, looking a little uncomfortable. "We didn't want to tell you when you were younger. We didn't want to freak you out. But the family who lived there before us, well, they had a little boy." She paused, looking at us, then added softly, "He drowned in the bathtub." I felt the blood drain from my face. My brother, who had been quiet until then, spoke up, his voice hoarse. "When?" My mom hesitated. "About a year before we moved in. He was around your age," she said, nodding toward my brother. "It was a horrible accident. The parents sold the house not long after it happened." I stared at my brother, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. He looked pale, his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to process what he was hearing. "You never told us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't want to scare you," my dad added, looking down at his hands. "It's not the kind of thing you tell kids." My brother stood up, pacing a little, his face contorted in disbelief. "Mom? Dad?" "I saw him," he said, the words tumbling out like a confession. "The boy. He was in my room." The room went dead silent. He told them everything. about the boy who wanted to play with his toys, about how he would sit at the end of the bed, staring at him with empty eyes, never leaving him alone, about the fear he felt every night. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, it all went quiet. The little boy had stopped visiting, and my brother had finally been able to sleep in his room again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unsaid. Standing by the closet, waiting for him in the middle of the night. He told them about the year he spent sleeping in my room because he couldn't bear the idea of being alone with that boy. My parents listened, looking more and more horrified with every word. I thought it was just nightmares. I muttered more to myself than anyone else. I didn't know what it was, my brother said, his voice shaky. But he was there. I didn't make him up. That conversation ended abruptly after that. My parents didn't want to talk about it anymore. And my brother, well, he didn't bring it up again either. But after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. All those times he had come to my room, terrified, insisting that the boy was there with him. I had brushed it off like it was just some childhood fear. But it wasn't. Even now, all these years later, I can't shake the feeling that something really was in that room with him. Something that liked his toys. Something that wanted to play. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if that boy is still there, waiting for someone else to play. If you enjoyed this eerie tale, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling stories and updates.